The morning routine began without negotiation. Roka held the measuring cord taut at the baseline mark while Kenji drew the brick mold through the mud clay mix. She had asked once how taut was taut. He had shown her with the cord and his thumb. She had not asked again. The cord was the difference between a wall and a drift. She understood this the way she understood that grip and position were the beginning of every physical argument. Mud on both of them before the sun had cleared the dune line. The basin had stopped feeling like hardship and started feeling like a job site. The second shelter wall moved faster than the first had by a third. Two pairs of hands solved the geometry of reach and hold that one pair could not. She lifted the mud block and held it level while he pressed it into the mortar line. The synchrony was not coordination yet. It was proximity becoming useful. The wall passed knee height by mid-morning. It passed waist height before the worst heat. He noted both times without announcing them. From above, the rising wall would have read as intention. Someone planned to stay. The three riders came over the north dune face at a canter. Deliberate pacing, not retreat, not charge. They were checking whether the settlement would react and how fast. The probe was professional. Kenji had read the same footprints last week. He and Roka separated without a word, moving to the positions they had rehearsed by walking the perimeter 2 evenings before. 3 riders, 2 defenders, 1 trench, several years of combined experience in being underestimated. The math was not settled yet. Roka stepped into the gap between the trench's 2 anchor stones and stood there with the stillness of a wall that had decided to be a gate. The lead rider pulled up short. A person her size holding position inside a known defensive structure was not an invitation to continue. She said nothing. Her silence had weight in the same way that her frame did. It occupied the space with a presence that required acknowledgement. The rider's horse stamped and retreated 2 steps on its own. Animals were often more honest about geometry than their riders. From the shelter's eastern corner, Kenji cut the anchor cord with his stone knife, and the trench concealment collapsed inward. The sound it made was loud enough and directionally wrong enough to scatter the rear rider's mount in the wrong direction. The lead rider had to choose between committing to a charge against a full-size defender or retreating through a suddenly smaller gap. They retreated, not in panic, which would have been less informative than the careful, calculated withdrawal that he watched them execute. When the riders cleared the second dune, Kenji and Roka stood in their respective positions and said nothing for a long moment. There was no inventory to take. The berm was undamaged. The water was undisturbed. The work would continue. He reset the trench anchor cord, doubling the fastening. Roka moved the flat stones back into their concealment positions. Neither paused. Winning was not a resting state. Winning was the condition under which the next work could safely happen. She almost smiled when the last rider disappeared. It was small and involuntary, and she extinguished it quickly. He saw it before it was gone. He made a point of looking back at the trench repair, because acknowledging the smile would have been unkind in the way only accurate observations can be. She had survived something alone before arriving here. The smile was the kind that escaped when the survival reflex had not yet been told the threat was over. He retied the cord with careful, unhurried hands. Somewhere behind him, he suspected she was reclaiming her face. They ate at dusk with the work between them on the ground in the form of the reset berm, the repacked mold frames, and the remeasured mortar ratios. The ration was the same as the night before, which was not a problem because adequacy did not require variety. He divided it by half without measuring. She took her half without checking. A calculation had been made and trusted. The first fire they had shared was already not the same fire as the first one. It was the third. She slid the larger portion toward him without looking up. He did not take it, and she did not argue. She pushed it slightly closer. He divided the difference and slid half back. The negotiation required no words, which was more efficient anyway. They ate the equalized portions as if this had always been the arrangement. It was the first domestic policy of Nova Terra. The fire between them ate its fuel with honest indifference. It would consume whatever they provided, as long as they kept providing. The shelter interior now had 2 sleeping positions, separated by a low stone shelf that served as divider, workbench, and unstated boundary in equal measure. Her side was spare. The brace hung from a cord above the sleeping mat, a folded cloth, a single personal item he had not cataloged. His side was a working archive. Measurement records, material tally, the blueprint scroll from the architect's system, 2 spare knife edges wrapped in bark. Together the space smelled of clay and fiber cord and the clean ozone smell of the still. It smelled like work in progress. Level 6 appeared in the architect overlay at the edge of his vision with the ceremony of a line item. No fanfare, just increment. The new blueprints that unlocked were structural, a water cistern design, a second-story stone addition concept, and a schematic for a simple gate mechanism. None of them were free. Each required materials he either lacked or could only obtain in quantity with more labor than 2 people could generate. The level did not make them safer. It made the gap between current capacity and potential capacity newly visible and precisely annoying. The brace was on her when she worked, when she ate, when she held positions against riders. It had become part of her silhouette. He had designed it to distribute load rather than eliminate it. She had used it to carry more than the design had anticipated. He found this gratifying in an engineering sense. Once, the lacing on the lateral support had worked loose without her mentioning it. He had noticed from her altered gait and relaced it during the morning measurement work. She had not commented. He had not mentioned it. The brace was information they shared through maintenance instead of words. He drew the bond pattern in the sand first. Running bond, header at every 5th course, corner tie every 12 bricks. She memorized it without tracing it, which was faster. The pattern existed to prevent vertical cracks. He explained this once. She understood that the stagger was not aesthetic, but mechanical. When she laid her first course under his supervision, she had already applied the header pattern correctly. She had extrapolated the rule from the drawing. He made one correction to her corner alignment, a half brick's worth of adjustment, and left the rest to stand as built. By afternoon, the lead rider's horse print from the morning had filled with wind drift, as if the desert were editing its own record of the attempted probe. Kenji watched the dune line for an hour, while Roka worked the second wall course. No silhouette returned. A probe that withdrew cleanly and did not return the same day was a patrol, not a raid. Patrols reported back and waited for orders. He began the defensive revision list in charcoal. Deeper trench, second tripwire, stone pile at the northeast angle. The riders would come again, better prepared. The berm had not taken a direct hit, but the collapse concussion had disturbed the outer face. He and Roka packed it tighter, adding a row of flint chips along the compacted surface. The flints would not stop a horse. They would redirect a horse, which was a different and more useful outcome. She worked the outer face by hand pressure while he packed from above. The technique had developed from a morning's experience without being discussed. When the berm was repacked and the flints were set, the defense was stronger than it had been before the probe. They had received intelligence and paid with none. She carried the heaviest stones from the quarry shelf to the construction site in a back frame she had assembled without consulting the blueprint. The back frame was scrub wood and cord, simple and correct, distributing the load across her shoulders instead of her spine. He had not thought to make one. The knee brace tracked with her weight transfer on every step. He watched the lateral support flex and recover correctly. He did not feel relief exactly. He felt engineering satisfaction. She made 9 trips before the shadow of the eastern dune crossed the work site. He had laid 4 courses of wall in the same time. The labor ratio was improving. The chapter's title was already written in the wall's rising face. 2 bond patterns, 2 sets of hand pressure indentations in the mortar, 2 heights of work visible in the courses. She worked from the ground. He worked from the stone ledge step. The wall rose between them like a proof that had been obvious once you saw it. He said other side once, and she moved without needing the sentence completed. The brevity was not rudeness. It was confidence in shared context. The wall's shadow at dusk was twice the width of the previous weeks. Shadow was the simplest way the desert kept score. He had built the fire halfway between the 2 sleeping positions out of habit, and it turned out to be precisely correct. 1 fire, 1 perimeter, 1 shared pool of light in a dark that extended to the horizon in every compass direction. She had offered to take the early watch. He had taken the late. The arrangement divided the night without dividing it badly. When he woke for his shift, her position near the fire was still warm. She had slept exactly as long as the arrangement specified. He found this deeply companionable. By the end of the 2nd week, the silence between them had changed texture. It was no longer the silence of 2 strangers sharing a space. It was the silence of 2 people who had run out of urgent things to communicate. She sharpened a spare knife edge one evening without being asked. He refilled her water cup at the still without comment. These were not performances. They were logistics. The quiet they built was not absence. It was a structure, same as the wall, load-bearing, present, the result of repeated correct action. He had come to the desert alone and built a settlement. She had come to the desert broken and helped finish one. The companionship was an outcome, not a plan. The shelter for 2 was done on a day with no particular weather and no system notification. Kenji pressed the final mortar joint, checked the corner for plumb, and stood back. Roka walked the perimeter, testing each wall face with her palm. She stopped at the northeast corner and pressed once. He had reinforced it after the probe. She felt the difference. The structure was not beautiful. It was adequate, and adequate in the desert was a word you could stake a life on. At the last fire of the chapter, she pushed the food toward him again, and this time he accepted it because rejecting the offer would have been impolite to the architecture of what they had built.